Have you ever felt like you were invisible, even though you were right in the middle of the scene? Of walking into a room with a kind smile, only to be treated like you were worthless? On that cold morning, as the sun tried to overcome the city's fog, a man with slow steps crossed the door of a small roadside restaurant. The sound of the doorbell was barely noticed. He was an elderly man, with snow-white hair, a face lined by the decades, and a faded military uniform, carrying on his chest the marks of a life that no one there seemed to care to know. He waved politely to the waiter, with the manner of someone who has learned to respect even those who don't look him in the eye. He sat down at the most discreet table and ordered a simple coffee. He didn't want anything more than that. But when he reached into his pocket and pulled out the coins he had, he realized it wasn't enough. The silence of that moment seemed to last an eternity. Some laughed. Others turned up their noses. Someone muttered, "Another one wanting something for free." And then, with a look full of judgment, the attendant spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "If you can't pay, leave. This is no shelter." Have you ever been treated like this? Have you ever felt the pain of carrying an entire story? And still being seen as a burden? The old man stood still for a second. Perhaps he didn't know whether it was embarrassment or exhaustion. Perhaps it was both. Without protesting, he got up with difficulty, adjusted his worn-out cap on his head, and left through the same door he had entered. But this time, with his eyes fixed on the ground. Outside, he sat down slowly on the curb, right next to the entrance. The city continued its frenetic pace, indifferent to the presence of that man. Cars passed by. People laughed inside the restaurant, cell phones rang. But he just looked. He stood there, motionless, with a blank stare, as if he were waiting for something. Or maybe nothing. A war veteran, discarded like old paper. He who had marched through jungles and deserts, who had seen death up close, who had held companions in his arms, now held only his own solitude. What makes someone treat with contempt someone who has given so much for their nation? Stay with me, because what you're about to discover in the next few minutes could change the way you see these stories, and maybe even the way you treat those who cross your path. At that moment, no one there knew. But that old man was keeping a secret. And in less than 30 minutes, something extraordinary would happen. But before that, his silence still had more to say. He remained there, sitting in the shade of the awning, his knees slightly bent and his hands clasped in his lap. The cold wind dragged dry leaves along the sidewalk, but he didn't move. He just looked ahead, as if he were looking for something that the world no longer offered. That makeshift bench on the curb seemed more comfortable than any chair in that restaurant. Not because of the welcome, but because there, at least, no one would throw him out. In his mind, old voices still echoed, shouted orders, the sound of helicopters, the crack of gunfire in the dark. Everything he faced to protect a country that now seemed to have forgotten him. No one out there knew that the man had carried a rifle for days without sleeping. No one knew about the letters he kept, stained with blood and broken promises. No one knew how many times he cried in the silence of the early morning, when the faces of his fallen comrades came to visit him in his dreams. And yet the world pushed him out as coldly as pushing an old newspaper under a door. Have you ever witnessed something like this? Have you ever seen someone being looked down upon for appearing invisible? Or have you ever felt this kind of silent loneliness firsthand? If so, write in the comments what has touched you the most so far. Your story can illuminate others. And if this type of content moves you, leave a like. It's not just a button. It's a sign that these stories still matter. And when you subscribe, you don't just follow, you become part of this mission, keeping alive the stories that the world insists on burying in oblivion. Your participation here is what keeps this channel going. It's what turns each video into a living memorial, a tribute, a reunion with what really matters. And while time outside seemed frozen, the old man, motionless in the corner of the sidewalk, still had more to reveal, because his silence wasn't over yet. He leaned his back against the cold, damp wall, his tired body slowly sinking into the rough concrete. The awning above only served to deflect a few drops of the fine drizzle, but the chill that cut through the air came from inside. It wasn't just the weather. It was loneliness. It was the silence of the people. It was the kind of cold that you can't dry with a coat because it lives where no one sees it. The cup of coffee he couldn't pay for remained in his memory as a cruel irony. He survived on combat rations for weeks in the field, trudged through muddy forests thirsty, hungry and afraid. But what brought him down wasn't the war. It was denied coffee in peacetime. A coffee he could almost taste in his throat, but it was ripped away from him along with his dignity. Not for the price, but for the contempt. Across the sidewalk, a child suddenly stopped. She was about 5, maybe 6, with curious eyes and small hands holding a bag of chips. She stared at the old man as if she saw something no one else could see. But before she could say anything, her mother grabbed her arm and pulled her closer. "Don't look at him. Come on." As if he were a danger, as if carrying scars was contagious, as if being old and poor was something too shameful for a child to see. The veteran simply lowered his eyes, avoiding the reflection in the display window in front of him. He knew what he would see there. A hunched man, his shoulders heavy not only because of time, but because of the way the world chose to erase him. A man with the dull gaze of someone who has already lost internal battles far greater than any armed confrontation, and who today was fighting a war that no one seemed to notice. The war against oblivion. The noises of the city no longer reached him. The hum of cars, the laughter inside, the clinking of cutlery on the tables. Everything dissolved into the distant sound of helicopters flying over the jungle, the echo of the cries for help that he had once tried to answer. Closing his eyes, he returned to a time where everything made more sense, where his presence mattered, where his mission was clear, where saving lives was not a reason for shame, but for honor. In his memory, he saw the faces of his companions. James, who died in his arms, asking him to deliver a letter. Rick, who never came home. Sanders, who screamed his children's names in the darkness. He saw their wide eyes, their blood mixed with the mud, their whispers that were lost among the gunshots, and with each memory, a pang in his chest, because he survived. But sometimes surviving is the cruelest part of the story. There, on the curb of a city that no longer knows who its heroes are, he carried the weight of a nation. No one saw. No one knew. No one cared. War, at least, recognized him as a soldier. Peace reduced him to a destitute stranger. He clutched his cap between his hands and bowed even lower. The movement was almost imperceptible, but it revealed a deep tiredness, not of the body, but of the soul. With each passing day, he felt further away from who he had been, as if her identity was slowly being erased by those who were supposed to protect her. And that hurt more than any open wound, because it was like dying slowly, with everyone watching, but no one noticing. Have you ever felt something similar? Not exactly with uniforms and medals, but with the feeling of being left out, of no longer fitting into the place that was once yours? Write in the comments. I feel that too. Because sometimes just knowing that someone else understands makes the pain a little less heavy. And the old man still stood there, motionless as time passed before him. But there was something in the air. Something about to happen. A presence that was approaching, still unnoticed by hurried eyes. Because even in the midst of contempt, the truth never ceases to exist. She just waits for the right time to be revealed. And when that time comes, what was invisible will become impossible to ignore. People kept passing by as if he were part of the sidewalk, a lamppost, a trash can, a piece of the cityscape that no one pays attention to. He didn't move. He just stared. And if you looked back carefully, you would notice something that you don't see in the eyes of someone who has lived an ordinary life. There was pain there. A thick, silent pain that doesn't scream, but bleeds inside. His gaze was not on the present. I was in some lost point of the past, where the snow fell without respite, where fingers purple with cold gripped a frozen rifle, where the sound of the radio was the only hope of not dying forgotten in a miscalculated mission. He relived everything again on that improvised bench, as if time was dragging him back. Not because it wanted to, but because his body still carried memories that the world had already forgotten. On that mission, he went 3 days without sleeping. The helicopter didn't arrive at the agreed time. One of his men was hit in the first ambush. Another died screaming for help, but they were so surrounded that any movement would be suicide. He held this second man by the hands, looking into his eyes until his last breath. He promised to tell his story. He promised to take care of his family. He promised to survive. And he survived. But survival comes at a high price when the world no longer wants to know your truth. He clutched his hands, as if he still held that blood. The nails were shaking. The shoulders slumped. And the heart beat at a rhythm that only those who have faced death recognize. Firm, resistant, but tired. With each beat, it was as if he carried on his back the weight of all the names left on the white crosses, the ones no one visits, the ones he never forgot. And then, like a cyclical nightmare, the same phrase came back to mind. If you can't pay, leave. It didn't just hurt because it was a denied coffee. It hurt because it symbolized everything. The lack of recognition, the lack of humanity, lack of memory. He gave the best of his youth, crossed oceans, slept in holes in the ground, lost friends and parts of his soul. And today, he couldn't buy a coffee without being humiliated. Have you ever noticed how some decisions we make mark us forever? How are there scars that no one sees, but that shape the way we walk, talk, breathe? He was living proof of that. A man who had everything to be remembered as a hero, but who walked the streets as if he were a social ghost. And the cruelest thing of all is that he accepted it. Not out of cowardice, but because war taught us that there are battles that are not won with weapons, but with silent resistance. The medals were kept, yes, but it wasn't out of vanity or fear. It was because he already understood that outside the battlefield, they mean nothing. The respect that once came with a salute was now replaced by looks of pity, or worse, disgust. As if time had swallowed his story, leaving only what was left: an aged body, worn-out clothes, and a soul trying not to disappear completely. The saddest thing of all is that even in that state, he still cared about the country. He still followed the news. He still believed in the values he swore to protect. But the country didn't seem to believe in him anymore. The transformation of a soldier into a forgotten citizen is not visible to the common eye. But for those who listen with their hearts, the hidden truth appears in small details. In the way he holds his cap, in the way his eyes look away whenever someone approaches, in the painful silence of someone who has shouted too much and has not been heard. There is something deeply unfair about seeing someone who was once a symbol of strength now seem like a social burden. But the most surprising thing was yet to come. Because at that moment, in the midst of all that pain, reality was already beginning to move behind the scenes. And like every great journey, sometimes you have to hit rock bottom for the true ascent to begin. There are things that cannot be explained with words. They are felt. And this story will still touch you deeply, because the change that is about to happen has the power to change the game. If this part reached you in any way, comment below. There is pain that no one sees. Let's keep going, because something big is coming. The minutes slipped by like cold sand through his fingers. He no longer knew whether he had sat there for half an hour or half a lifetime. The city spun around itself, fast, noisy, indifferent, as if the world had become deaf to the silent scream emanating from that man hunched over on the curb. It was an anguish that could not be measured in words, only in heavy breathing. Each breath he let out seemed like a cry for help that no one heard. And it wasn't because of hunger, nor the cold. It was because of his soul that was breaking a little more with each second. Life, which had once applauded him for his acts of courage, now passed him by in a hurry, and, worse than ignoring him, it mocked him. A shiny black car parked a few meters away. The driver, in a sharp suit and with a glassy gaze, stared at him for 2 seconds. And 2 seconds were enough for judgment to be made. With a slight movement of his chin, as if shooing away an insect, he looked away and continued talking on his cell phone. Soon after, an elegant couple approached the restaurant entrance. Noticing the old man sitting in the shade, the woman held her partner's hand tightly and murmured something. "You should be ashamed of yourself for taking up space like that." "Fish!" The man let out a muffled laugh, and the two of them walked into the restaurant as if they had avoided a piece of trash left on the sidewalk. The veteran just lowered his eyes. He clutched his cap between his fingers, as if that piece of fabric were his last defense against his inner collapse. It was the only thing he could still hold without it being ripped off. And even then, his gesture trembled. His shoulders were not shaking from the cold, but from a kind of pain that could not be explained. A pain that dragged on, that consumed, that humiliated. A tear ran down his face without him noticing. But no one noticed. People were too busy being important. There, alone, he thought about the choices he made. He thought about the decisions that led him to that sidewalk. I wondered if it was all really worth it. Having risked one's life, having left family behind, having buried friends in a foreign land, he wondered whether fighting for a nation that now saw him as a nuisance was, in fact, an error of judgment. And yet, he did not rebel. He didn't scream. He didn't ask for anything. Because he learned, over time and through war, that shouting doesn't always solve the problem. That sometimes the true impact of a story happens in the silence, behind the scenes of life, in the space where the world is not looking. The cars passed by. People were coming in and out of the restaurant. The smell of hot coffee and fresh bacon danced in the air like a cruel taunt. And there he was, with an empty stomach, a full chest, and his eyes growing shallower. From afar, a different sound began to invade the monotony. A rhythmic, metallic, pulsating noise. Sirens. But not the kind where the police are in a hurry. They were long, low-pitched sirens, like those of an official procession. And it was at that moment that something moved inside him. The people around him didn't seem to notice. They were busy with their screens, their steps, their requests. But he felt it. The kind of intuition that only those who have been in hostile territory understand. Something was about to happen. And then he lifted his chin slightly, as if listening to an old, distant song. His posture changed. Still haggard, but with an old, almost military stiffness. His tired body could not move, but his soul seemed alert. There was something in the air. Something that could not be seen, but could be felt. And despite everything, despite the contempt, the rejection, the pain of being forgotten, at that moment, his eyes shone with a spark that time could not extinguish. The world had forgotten, but the heavens, perhaps the heavens still remembered. Write in the comments. Silence also speaks. Something is coming, and it's going to change everything. The sound of large engines echoed down the avenue with a presence that no one could ignore. Shiny black SUVs appeared one by one, forming a sort of impenetrable procession. The lights flashed rhythmically, and the security guards jumped out of the vehicles with the speed of those who knew exactly what to protect. Men in suits, earphones in their ears, hands poised, eyes scanning every corner. This was no ordinary convoy. This was power. This was the state. Immediately, like an instinctive swarm, the people inside the restaurant rushed to the windows. Some stepped out onto the sidewalk. Cell phone cameras were hastily raised. The manager, sweating at his temples, adjusted his tie for the third time in 30 seconds. Even those who had been oblivious to everything around them minutes before were now pushing forward to get a closer look. The veteran remained there, exactly where he was, sitting, silent, almost motionless, but his gaze, oh, his gaze said it all. An old glow reappeared in his tired eyes, as if an old memory had returned with smell, sound, and temperature. There was something in that movement that activated memories that had been kept under lock and key. He showed no fear, no enthusiasm either, Just the kind of deep attention reserved for those who have lived long enough to know that in the real world, the unexpected doesn't usually send a message before it arrives. The doors of the main SUV opened. The air seemed to catch in the lungs of those watching. Time slowed down for a few seconds. A man got out, tall, with a firm posture, an impeccable suit, determined eyes. It was the former president, a name known to everyone in that country. A face plastered across newspapers, magazines, documentaries. A man who made history. And now, he walked with firm steps down that sidewalk as if he knew exactly where he needed to go. But then something happened. Something no one expected. He didn't turn to face the restaurant. He didn't wave to the cameras. He didn't greet the manager sprawled in the doorway. He walked straight to the old man sitting on the floor. The crowd around them fell silent, as if the air had suddenly been sucked out of them. Each step that man took towards the veteran was a break in the narrative that everyone there had created in their heads. That man who had been despised, chased away, ignored minutes before, was now the absolute focus of the most powerful figure in the country. The veteran remained seated. He simply looked up. There was a recognition there that words could not explain. The two men looked at each other as if the entire world had disappeared. And for a moment, it did. There was no restaurant. There were no ties. There were no raised cell phones. There were just two men. Two pasts. Two lives intertwined by something that no one there knew, yet. The former president stopped in front of him. He took a deep breath. His eyes filled with tears. And then he knelt down. He lowered himself to the level of the man who, to everyone up until then, had been nothing more than a defeated old man. He didn't say anything right away. He didn't need to. He simply grabbed the shoulders of that fragile body and pulled him into a hug. A long hug. Heavy. Full of layers that no one could understand, but everyone felt. And as the people watched in absolute silence, the veteran's mind returned, once again, to that forgotten battlefield, where a young soldier, wounded and panicked, trembled amid explosions, about to die. He remembered that face, that voice, the cut on the side of his neck, the smell of gunpowder. It was him, that man kneeling there, the one who now ruled the country. He had been just another scared boy in the midst of chaos. And he, the old man on the ground, was the one who had carried him on his back for more than a mile through the gunfire. The memory came back to him in its entirety. Raw. He had saved that man. Not once, but twice. In the field. And now, again, in his memory. The crowd slowly approached. Cell phones were shaking in their hands. No one could understand what they were seeing. But everyone felt that something big was happening. And perhaps that is the power of silent revelations. They don't need to be explained because the impact is felt before the words even arrive. Write in the comments. There are stories that no one imagines. Because what comes next will reveal a hidden truth that will shake you to your core. That hug lasted longer than anyone expected, and less than he deserved. The former president's hands trembled on the old man's bent back, while thick tears fell on the shoulder of the man who had saved him decades before, in a distant and forgotten land. He was not crying out of weakness, but out of weight. A weight that had been kept for years, perhaps the same weight that the other had carried in silence his entire life, and that now, for a few seconds, was shared between the two. The world around us stopped, literally. Cars slowed down. Conversation stopped. Cell phones were slowly put away, not out of lack of interest, but out of pure respect. The atmosphere changed, as if time had given way to the truth. A raw, indisputable truth that no one there could avoid anymore. The restaurant manager, the same one who had sent him away minutes before, staggered back, visibly unresponsive. Arrogance seeped into the corners of his eyes. Embarrassment was present in every clumsy movement. It was as if he finally saw what had been right in front of him all along, and had simply refused to see. The former president stood up slowly. The silence continued, and then, with a choked voice, he spoke firmly. This man saved my life. I should have been dead. I was shot in the chest, bleeding in the middle of the forest. No helicopters were coming. The enemy surrounded me on all sides, and this man, alone, carried me on his shoulders for more than 2 kilometers. He hid me in a hole, tore his own shirt to stop the bleeding, and stayed with me for 2 days, without sleeping, without eating, protecting my life as if it were his own. Everyone's eyes turned to the old man, but he remained silent, motionless. His eyes were filled with tears, yes, but his face was serene. There was no vanity there, no pride, just the expression of someone who had finally been seen after spending too long invisible. And do you know what he said when the rescue arrived? The former president continued. He just said, "Take care of your mission, sir, because I took care of mine," and he disappeared. It was at that moment that everyone's eyes filled with tears. Because this story was not just about war, or about a heroic act. It was about purpose, about legacy, about hidden truth. It was about a man who, even when scorned, did not stop fulfilling his mission until the end. The silence was broken by a single sound, the clicking of hundreds of cameras recording the scene. But no image would be able to capture the real weight of that moment. There was a veteran, humiliated for not having enough money for a coffee, being recognized for something that money can't buy. Honor, the real kind. The kind that makes no noise, doesn't need a platform, but that transforms everything around it when it is finally revealed. A waiter, the same one who had previously served him with disdain, approached hesitantly. In his hands, a tray with a steaming cup. He knelt down, his eyes lowered, and offered the old man the coffee that had previously been denied him. But it was no longer a cafe. It was a wordless apology. It was an attempt to repair the irreparable. It was the symbol of a system that, for a moment, awakened from its own ego. And the old man, he accepted. With his hands still trembling, he held the cup. And in that instant, as the steam slowly rose, everyone there felt that they were in the presence of something sacred. A moment of transformation. Not just for him, but for everyone watching. Because that wasn't the story of just one man. It was the story of everyone who had been forgotten, ignored, judged before they were understood. And yet, they chose to continue, without expecting applause. Shall we go deeper into this journey? Because not everything has been said yet, and there are truths hidden in the details that follow. Comment there. Honor does not need applause. There's more to this story, and it's about to come to light. The next morning, the restaurant was no longer the same. The same stained awning that had once cast a shadow over an old reject now held flowers, candles, and flags. The sidewalk where he had sat for nearly an hour in silence had become a makeshift altar. Not because anyone planned it, but because the people felt it. It was as if the country, for a moment, had awakened from its own selfishness and said, "Enough." The news spread like wildfire. A single image was enough. The former president kneeling before an old man in shabby clothes and with teary eyes. All it took was a single video. The moment when the truth broke through the silence. Newspapers, portals, broadcasters. Everyone rushed to understand what happened, but it was no longer about headlines. It was about impact, on collective regret, on the brutal power of an unexpected revelation. Veterans began to appear, some in wheelchairs, others leaning on canes. Men who had not seen each other for decades met again on that sidewalk. They were not summoned. They came for honor. They came because they recognized in that gesture something they never had, or something they had buried along with their companions. The old man, sitting at the same table where he had once been denied coffee, was now served with ceremony. The cup was new, but the steam carried something ancient. Respect. Silence. Reverence. No words were spoken as he lifted the drink to his lips, but everyone understood. Coffee was not the end of the story. It was the symbol of a cycle that was finally closing. And the most curious thing, is that he remained the same. The same tired eyes, the same restrained gestures, the same simplicity of someone who does not seek the spotlight, but fulfills a mission. He did not smile like someone who has won, nor did he cry like someone who has suffered. He simply accepted, with the dignity of someone who has always known his worth, even when the world insisted on ignoring him. Days later, an official tribute was announced. It wasn't his idea. He wasn't even consulted. But veterans from around the country have come together to fund a statue. Not of polished bronze or imposing pedestal. The proposal was simple: a monument at the entrance to the restaurant, exactly where he was humiliated. And there it was erected, an old man sitting on the curb, holding a cap in both hands. The expression on his face. Silence. But a silence that said it all. The sculpture became a point of interest for visitors. Schools took children to learn about values that cannot be taught in books. Military personnel saluted as they passed by. Strangers knelt, left letters, photos, medals, words never spoken. The sidewalk became sacred ground, not because of the statue, but because of the history it carried. And the former president, he spoke again, not in his usual formal tone, but with the choked voice of someone who has been transformed by a reunion. "Heroes don't ask for recognition," he said, "but we have a duty to give it." That day, he decreed something beyond speeches: the creation of a national program to recognize and care for forgotten veterans, a bill, funds, and, most importantly, attention. Because it became clear that medals without memory are just cold metal, and the image of the old man drinking his coffee went around the world. It became a symbol, a meme, a t-shirt. But for those who saw it up close, it wasn't viral. It was visceral. It was too real to become a fad. There, where he had once been sent away for having no coins, now the entire country seemed to be paying a debt that should never have existed. And even with all this upheaval, with all this unexpected glory, he continued to do the same thing every morning. He sat on the same bench, took the same cup, looked out into the street in silence. And when someone passed by and said, "Thank you," he would just nod, as if to say, "That's not why I did it." Because he knew that true heroism is not measured in applause, but in purpose. And his was accomplished. Comment there. Respect is not asked for. It is lived. If you've come this far, it's because something in this story really touched you. And that says a lot about your heart. Stories like this aren't just meant to move us. They're meant to remind us of what really matters. Of respect, empathy, and the silent courage that often goes unnoticed. And if, at some point, you felt that this message was also for you, then our conversation was worth it. If you want to continue following content like this, that goes deep, that delivers more than words and creates a real connection, subscribe to the channel here. It will be an honor to walk with you in the next stories. Leave a like too, if this made sense to you. Not because of the number, but because it's the simplest way to show that this type of content still has a place in the world. And to show that you stayed until the end, comment below, "I saw the transformation happen." It's always special to see who stayed until the last line of this journey. There's a video here that complements all of this. Click and continue with me there. The next story also carries something powerful. I'll wait for you there.